Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and Mir Hashem today we will be completing Daf Samach Ches Amid Beis. Before we begin, our learning should be Oschos Frachenu Kol Beis Yisrael Hanesuna Batzara Bashivya Ha'imdim Bein Bayama Bein Bayabasha Hamakim Yirachem Aleihem V'Yotzim Mitzar L'Rvacha Me'afel L'Oiro B'Shibel L'Geula Hashta B'Gala V'Zman Kariv V'Nemar Amen. Especially our thoughts go out to those who are in harm's way, to their families, to all of those who are in Sakana, in Eretz Yisrael and elsewhere. Also, our learning should be Oschus Refuah Shalema for Ariel Yosef ben Miriam Rezel, for Meir ben Chaya Sarah, and for Gavriel ben Bella Rivka, who are all in need of Rachamei Shamayim. Before we begin, I do want to say, I know that things have been a little bit rocky of late on this year. Baruch Hashem, I made a simcha, and with a lot of other things going on, it's been a little bit difficult to be as steady as I like to be. I'm really trying to get things back on track, but we're doing the best that we can. So today, we're going to pick up on Samach Ches Amid Beis. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Petzias Hapas. We're picking up Siman Kuf Samach Ches in the midst of Sif Yud. Now, I'm going to read the Mechaber from the very beginning of Sif Yud, the last few words on Samach Ches Amud Aleph, for the sake of continuity. In the last year, we went at great length through the Hakdama of the Mechaber to Sif Yud, so we already have the basic background over here, and let's kind of in the Mishnah Berurah, at least, we'll pick up where we left off. So reading from the beginning of the Mechaber, Siman Kuf Samach Ches Sif Yud, last several words on Samach Ches Amud Aleph, says the Mechaber, Chavitza. And what is a Chavitza? The Mechaber defines it right away. And as we saw in the Hakdama of the Mishnah Berurah, there are going to be a few different varieties of Chavitza. What all of the Chavitzas have in common is they are breadcrumbs that are either combined together to form one mass through the addition of some kind of a liquid agent, a binding agent, or they're maybe not combined into one mass, but it is a dish that is made out of breadcrumbs. So that's what a chavitza is. A chavitza is a dish made out of breadcrumbs, but it comes in different varieties. So the Mechaber says chavitza, dahainu. What is a chavitza? Dahainu. Pirurei lechem, breadcrumbs, shenidbakim yachad, that are combined together al yedei marok, using a liquid binding agent. Marok is a sauce or a gravy, some kind of a liquid. So we have breadcrumbs. Now, breadcrumbs are completely pas. We're not dealing here with pas ababakistan. We're dealing with genuine pas. You took challah, or you took a matzah, or you took rye bread. So this is genuine 100% pas, but you crumbled it up. And now you joined it together, you combined it using some kind of a binding agent. Okay, says the Mechaber, what's the bracha? Well, it depends what you do with this dish. Says the Mechaber, continuing on the top line of Samach Ches Amud Beis, im nispashel, if you take this combination, so you take the breadcrumbs that have been combined together with a liquid, im nispashel, if you cook it, okay, now it depends. Im yesh pahem kazayis, if the breadcrumbs, the crumbs or the pieces of bread that you used to form this, if they have a kazayis, then, says the Mechaber, afal pi she'ein bayit tayar lechem, even if the final product over here does not have tayar lechem. Tayar lechem means it doesn't have the appearance of bread. It's not something that you look at and you say, oh, that's bread. And by default over here, once you take these breadcrumbs or these pieces of bread and you cook them, the assumption is that the tayar lechem is gone. We assume that there's no tayar lechem. So the Mechaber says, you had bread, you crumbled it up, you combined it using a liquid, and now you cooked it. Says the Mechaber, im nispashel, you cooked it, im yesh bahem kazayis, if there is a piece that's a kazayis, afal pi she'ein bo tayar lechem, even though the final product has no tayar lechem, mevarich hamoitzi uberkas hamazon. The bracha remains hamoitzi. The bracha rishona is hamoitzi because you had pas, you had genuine 100% pas, and even though you crumbled it up, you have a piece or pieces that are at least a kazayas. Even though you cooked it and you removed the tayar lechem, that does not downgrade the bracha rishona from a birkas hamoitzi or birkas hamazon, and the bracha achrona is birkas hamazon. It had a kazayas, it was genuine pas. You have pieces over here that are a kazayas. You went ahead and you cooked it, so yes, it lost tayar lechem, but it doesn't matter. Genuine pas, pieces that are bigger than a kazayas, you got to make hamoitzi and birkas hamazon. V'im ein behem kazayas, but let's say you don't have a kazayas. Let's say you crumbled up the bread, you crumbled up the challah, you crumbled up the matzah so completely that it's mamish breadcrumbs. Im ein behem kazayas, then afal pi shenireh sheyesh bai tayar lechem, even though you might look at the final product and you might think that it has tayar lechem, you look at it and you say, oh, it looks kind of bread-like to me. You only make a bracha barei mina mezainos, ubracha achas mein shalosh, and the bracha achrona is going to be ala michya. The bracha achrona is going to be a bracha achas mein shalosh. So again, the very first case of the mechaber over here, and this was case number 1 discussed by the Mishnah Berurah in his Hakdama, is you took bona fide bread. You took absolute bread, rye bread, challah, matzah. You broke it up, and then you took it and you added liquid to it. So you kind of combined these pieces of bread or these breadcrumbs into a dish. And now you went ahead and now you cooked it. Says the mechaber, it depends. If the pieces, and we're going to see that even though I keep saying the pieces, even if there's one piece, so you've got a bowl of this cooked dish, and you poke around in it, and you see that there's one piece of bread that's a kazayas or bigger, or there's one piece of matzah that's a kazayas or bigger, then that piece is hamoitzi. And once you make hamoitzi on that piece, you're going to pater the rest of the dish. But if there's a piece in there that's hamoitzi, that's a kazayas or bigger, it's hamoitzi. Why? Because it's genuine pas, and even though you cooked it, since it's bigger than a kazayas, it doesn't lose the din of pas. It remains a lechem, it remains pas, and you got to make hamoitzi and birkas hamazon. On the other hand, if you took your matzah, your challah, your bread, and you crumbled it so small that all of the pieces are less than a kazayas, now I'll give you a very simple case of this. You took matzah, and you ground it up into matzah meal, and you made Kneidlach. So you took matzah, genuine 100% pas. You ground it up into pieces that are less than a kazayas. You made matzah meal out of it. You combined it using a liquid. You used eggs, you used oil, you used seltzer. Now you took it and you dropped it into a pot of boiling water and you cooked it to make a kneidl. Even if you look at that resultant kneidl and you think, looks kind of bread-like to me, I think it has tayar lechem, it's a mezainos and a bracha achas mein shalosh because it has been downgraded from pas into a tavshil. Now, I'm not going to do all of the Mishnah Berurah on this because we did all of the Mishnah Berurah running through. We stopped at ois katan nun daled. I'm going to pick up with the Mishnah Berurah on ois katan nun gimel. The mechaber said, you broke up your bread, you combined it with a binding agent, and you cooked it. What we have to look at now is how big are the pieces. And the mechaber said, im yesh bahem kazayas. Literally, that means if the pieces are at least a kazayas. Says the Mishnah Berurah Katan Gimel, lav dafka bekula. You don't need that all of the pieces of bread in this dish are a kazayas. Ela afilu im yesh kazayas b'choda prusa. Even if in the dish now there's one piece that's a kazayas, gam kein mevarach aleh hamoitzi uberkas hamazon. You make hamoitzi on that piece, and after eating this entire dish, you bench. Once you make the hamaitzi on one piece that is a hamaitzi, you pottered all of the smaller pieces, and you'll potter it all with the bracha achrayna of Birkas Hamazon. Now, I don't have a good example coming to my mind of a dish that we make this way. This is not French toast. This is not Matzoh Brei, and we'll see why in a moment. But let's say you would make some kind of a cereal where you would take challah. It's also, I don't want to get into challah kugel either, because challah kugel is already baked, and we're going to talk about baked later. Right now we're talking about cooked. If you would have some kind of dish where you took bread and you broke it up into pieces, and let's say you soaked it in maybe an egg, maybe milk with some sugar and some cinnamon, and you went ahead and you put it in a pot and you cooked it. So the halacha would be, when it finishes cooking, you take it, you put it into a bowl, and you want to eat it, you got to take a look. Are there any pieces in the dish that are kazayas or bigger? If there's a piece in the dish that's a kazayas, then you got to wash the tilas yadayim, make hamaitzi on that piece, potter all the rest of it, and if you eat a kazayas of this dish, then afterwards you're going to make Birkas Hamazon, you're going to bench. Now, my first answer to you would be, if you're going to make such a dish, make sure that you break up all of the pieces to be less than a kazayas. Because if you break up all of the pieces to be less than a kazayas, then you have no shilas. If you break it up so that all the pieces are less than a kazayas, and for that, I gave you a beautiful example. Example would be Kneidlach. If you broke up the matzah, or you broke up your bread to pieces that are all less than a kazayas, that's still a pretty substantial piece, but it's not a kazayas. Now, since you cooked it, it loses the bracha of pas, it becomes a tafshil, it becomes a mezainas, and a bracha achas me'ein shalosh. Ois cotton nun dalid in the Mishnah Berurah. The Mechaber said over here, if there is a kazayas, which we explained means even if there's one piece that's kazayas. Now says the Mishnah Berurah cotton nun dalid kazayas ritzoner loymar. When we say that if there's a piece that's a kazayas, we mean bahaprusa atzma shemevarech aleha. You find a piece in the dish that is a kazayas, and you're going to make a bracha on that piece. In Ritzayin Loimar, what the Mechaber means to say is bahaprusa atzma shemevarech aleha. The piece from this dish that you're going to make a bracha on, hayaba kazayas mikoidim. It was a kazayas, meaning when you broke up the bread or when you broke up the matzah, this piece was a kazayas, and it didn't shrink from the cooking. But if you broke all of the pieces up to less than a kazayas, but now what happened is that through the combination and through the cooking process, a bunch of pieces got clumped together, and now you have a clump that's bigger than a kazayas. No, that's not considered a piece that's bigger than a kazayas. That's several pieces that combined to make a kazayas. On that, we're not going to make a hamaitzi. We only make a hamaitzi if there was a piece that was originally a kazayas and it remained a kazayas throughout the cooking process. We don't add to it if it combined with other pieces, or if you have a piece of bread that was smaller than a kazayas, but it swelled up because it absorbed liquid. No. So when the Mechaber says that if you made a cooked dish out of broken up bread, if there's a piece that's a hamaitzi, you have to make a hamaitzi and then you have to bench, that's talking about where there was a piece of bread originally that was a kazayas. It remained a kazayas through the cooking process. It didn't shrink. It remained a kazayas on its own. It didn't combine with other pieces to become a kazayas, and not that it swelled up from the liquid. It was a kazayas when it was dry. That's when you're going to make a bracha of a hamaitzi and Birkas Hamazon. Ais cotton nun hay. The Mishnah Berurah said that this is true when there's a piece bigger than a hamaitzi, the Mechaber said when there's a piece bigger than a kazayis, you're going to make hamaitzi. The Mechaber said that's true even if it does not have tayar lechem. And here's the key Mishnah Berurah here. The kevan sheyesh b'hem kazayis, because since you have at least one piece that's a kazayis, loydis batel mimena shem lechem. If it is a kazayis, it didn't lose the shem lechem, even though it lost tayar lechem because you cooked it. So even though the cooking process cost the bread the tayar lechem, it doesn't look like lechem anymore. Since it was genuine pas and it still is a kazayis, it doesn't lose the din lechem, and you have to make a moitzi at Birkas Hamazon. Ois cotton nun vav. Then the Mechaber said, but if you broke up all of the pieces to the extent that they're all less than a kazayis, then you make a mezainos. And the Mechaber said that's true, even if to you it looks like it still has tayar lechem. Says the Mishnah Berurah cotton on vav, shenira, even though it appears to you that it still has tayar lechem, it's only a mezainos. And says the Mishnah Berurah, why? Tekevan shenis bashal, because once you cooked it, einoi choshev tayar lechem. You might think that Kneidlach looks bread-like. You might look at it and say, yeah, to me it looks like bread. Nope. Once it was cooked, the halacha says it doesn't have tayar lechem. So now, you have pieces that are less than a kazayis, it doesn't have tayar lechem. In that case, it's a mezainos. Now comes a very important Mishnah Berurah here. Until now, we were talking about a case where you made this dish by cooking it in liquid in a pot. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, let's say you didn't cook it in a pot. Ela tignam b'mashke, you fried it in some kind of a mashke, some kind of a liquid, b'makavas, in a pan or a griddle. So, this would be Matzoh Brei, or this would be, let's say, French toast. So now you have pieces of matzah. Let's tackle Matzoh Brei for a minute. How do you make Matzoh Brei? You take matzah, you break it up into pieces, you soak it in egg, and then you take it, you throw it into a frying pan with oil, and you fry it. So now you're not cooking it. Now, let's break this down step by step. You had matzah, bona fide pas. The bracha is hamaitzi, and the noch bracha, the bracha acharona, is Birkas Hamazon. You broke it up, you soaked it in egg, and now you want to throw it into a frying pan. First question, how big are the pieces? If the pieces are a kazayis or bigger, now right away dealing with matzah, we're used to how big a sheer kazayis is. By a machine matzah, it's almost a whole machine matzah to make a kazayis. Nobody's making Matzoh Brei out of pieces that are out of machine matzah, a whole machine matzah. They're breaking it up. Hand shmura matzah, my hand shmura matzah from the Shmura Matzah Bakery, 13th Avenue, 36th Street. That's very thick matzah. So my hand matzah, a kazayis is approximately a half a matzah. I would assume that if you're dealing with Schatzer of blessed memory matzah, right? The Schatzer Matzah Bakery, I think, is no longer extant. I think it closed down last year. Or some of the other matzah bakeries that have really, really, really thin matzah, it might be a whole hand matzah that's kazayis. Again, nobody's making Matzoh Brei out of pieces that big. If the pieces would be that big, then I don't care if it has tayar lechem. I don't care if it's cooked or it's fried. It doesn't matter. If the pieces are bigger than a kazayis, then even if it's cooked, the bracha is hamaitzi and Birkas Hamazon. So if it's fried, we're going to see, is a notch down from cooking. Cooking definitely takes away tayar lechem. Frying, we're not sure frying takes away tayar lechem. But so by Matzoh Brei, definitely the pieces are going to be less than a kazayis. If the pieces were more than a kazayis, there's no shaila. That's why by French toast, there's no shaila. French toast, you generally make French toast out of a whole slice of bread. Usually by French toast, the pieces are going to be a kazayis. So if the pieces are kazayis, there's no shaila. If the pieces are kazayis, it's hamaitzi. But let's say you're making Matzoh Brei and the pieces are less than a kazayis. Now, okay, so now we're dealing with we have pieces that are less than a kazayas. If frying the Matzoh Brei is called cooking, so then that's mamish this case of the mechaber over here. You have pieces that are less than a kazayas. You cooked it. It loses tayar lechem. It's no longer hamoitzi. It's a mezainis and a brach achroina of an alamichya. But what the Mishnah Berurah is going to introduce to us right over here is we're not sure if frying equals cooking. It could be that frying does not equal cooking. Maybe frying does not take off the tayar lechem. And if frying doesn't take off the tayar lechem, then it could be that even though the pieces are less than a kazayas, it could be the bracha is still hamoitzi. So let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah. Again, we're continuing in Eis Katan Nun Vav. V'im loy bishlam b'kedera. If you did not cook the pieces that you broke up in a pot, elatignam b'mashke b'machvas, rather you fried them in a mashke like oil, in a pan or a griddle, mashbe mi magen Avram sif katan lamed vav t'lo have a kibishel. The mashmois of the magen Avram is that frying is not bishel. Umahani ba tayar lechem. And then, if the pieces still have tayar lechem, the bracha is going to remain hamoitzi. Kamay l'kamei ba'ofen hasheni, like we're going to see when we get into the second version of chavitza. In the second version of chavitza, you don't cook the breadcrumbs. You just combine the breadcrumbs together using a binding agent. And in that case, if the resulted product retains tayar lechem, then the bracha is hamoitzi. So again, what we're saying over here is the mechaber is talking about a case in version number 1 of chavitza, where you broke up the bread, you broke up the matzah, and you cooked it. Since you cooked it, we assume it loses tayar lechem. Since we assume it loses tayar lechem, then the determining factor is the size of the pieces. If the size of the pieces are kazayas or bigger, we don't care that it lost tayar lechem. It's hamoitzi and brechas hamazon. But if the pieces are less than a kazayas, so then it's less than a kazayas and no tayar lechem because you cooked it, then it's a mezainis and an alamichya. But now when you made Matzoh Brei with pieces less than a kazayas, you fried it, you didn't cook it. Frying, the Mishnah Berurah says, maybe doesn't take off the tayar lechem. If frying doesn't take off the tayar lechem, then your Matzoh Brei is still hamoitzi. So what do you do, Lamaisa? Says the Mishnah Berurah, or lefi das sharei achrayim sham, according to other achrayim who disagree with the Magen Avram, ein hechrech ledvarav. They say that the opinion of the Magen Avram is not muchach, v'hanochain, and therefore the proper thing to do is shebetigun, that something like Matzoh Brei which you fry, lo yoichal b'sheyesh bai tayar lechem, ki im b'say chasuda. If you make Matzoh Brei and you look at that Matzoh Brei and it still has tayar lechem, it still looks like pieces of matzah, well then it has tayar lechem. If it still has tayar lechem after you fried your Matzoh Brei, then says the Mishnah Berurah, don't eat it, kiyim b'say chasuda. Only eat it if you're going to wash on something else. So if it's Pesach and you want to eat Matzoh Brei, even though you broke up the pieces to be less than a kazayas, if you look at the Matzoh Brei and it looks like pieces of matzah, then you have to wash on another regular piece of matzah, wash on an unfried piece of matzah, and eat the Matzoh Brei b'say chasuda. Eat it after you've washed on a regular piece of matzah, so you'll pater it with hamoitzi and with brechas hamazon. V'chol zeh b'she'ein b'hem kazayas. Now, of course, this is only negeya if you broke up the pieces to be less than a kazayas. Avalim tigein prusais sheyesh b'hem kazayas. If you fried pieces that are at least a kazayas large, afilu azalei atar lechem, then even if it did lose the tar lechem, poshut, it's obvious to bavar chamoitzi, that you make chamoitzi the chanal bebishul, like we just saw. If you cook it, the choshkein bazeh, certainly if you fry it, cooking it makes it easier to turn it into a mezainos, because cooking we assume takes away the tar lechem. Frying, we're not sure if it takes away the tayar lechem. So if you fried it and the pieces are bigger than a kazayas, even if you would have cooked it, the bracha would be hamaitzi. So certainly if you only fried it, the bracha is going to be hamaitzi. Eis Katan Nun Zayin. So if the pieces are less than a kazayas and you cooked it, einoi mevarech ela bar min mezainis, the mechaber said, then the bracha is bar min mezainis. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cutting on Zayin Da. Realize the bechol hani shenizkar b'sif zeh, by all the cases in this sif ubasiifim she'acharav, and in the coming seifim, afilu kava seudasai aleim va'akal kidei sevia. Even if you're kavei asuda on these things and you eat mamash a full meal, mevarch bar yamin mezainos va'acharav me'ein shalosh. If you have Kneidlach, which we just said, the bracha on Kneidlach is a mezainos because it's pas, it's matzah meal, that you broke up into pieces that are less than a kezayis, and you cooked it, so there's no tayar lechem. So we said now the bracha is mezainos. Don't mix this up with pas haba b'kistin. Pas haba b'kistin, the bracha is mezainos, but if you're kavei suda on it, it becomes hamoitzi and benching. Not so Kneidlach. You could be kavei sudan Kneidlach. You could eat 22 beitzim worth of Kneidlach, and you could be mamish full, and I don't want to eat another thing. You're still going to make a mezainos. Why? Because this is no longer pas. This is worse than pas ababikistin. The tayar lechem is gone, and the pieces were less than a kezayis. It's not pas. Pas ababikistin is pas. It's just pas that you're normally not kavei sudan. This is not pas. Mishum dolev b'klal lechem klal. The stuff that we're talking about over here is not called lechem. It's not pas. Rak kimini kedera ba'alma. All it is a cooked dish on which you make a mezainos. Okay, before we go weiter in the mechaber, I know I'm being very repetitive, but like I always say, when it comes to subjects that are so complex, I feel like I have to be repetitive. In the first scenario over here, covered by the mechaber, what we're dealing with is you have genuine 100% pas, not pas ababikistin. You have rye bread, you have challah, you have matzah. You broke it up into pieces, you added a liquid. So, I don't know, you took bread, you broke it up into pieces, you put it into a bowl, you cracked open an egg, you put in some milk, some sugar, some cinnamon, a little vanilla, you went ahead and you combined it, and now you throw it into a pot and you cook it in a pot. Not fry. You're cooking it in a pot. What's the halacha? Says the mechaber, the halacha is it depends. Look at the pieces. If you have pieces that are a kezayis or bigger, or you have even one piece that's a kezayis or bigger, then wash the tilas yadayim, make hamoitzi on that piece, pater the rest of the dish with the hamoitzi that you made, and if you eat a kezayis or more, afterwards bench. If, on the other hand, you broke up the pieces so that all of the pieces are less than a kezayis, and then you went ahead and you cooked it, now the bracha becomes mezainos, and the nach bracha is bracha achas bein shalish. Why? Because since you cooked it, it no longer has tayar lechem. I don't care if you think it does have tayar lechem. Since you cooked it, there's no tayar lechem. Since there's no tayar lechem, and you're dealing with pieces that are less than a kezayis, it's no longer considered lechem. It's called a tavshil. Now, it's a grain-based tavshil. It's minei dagon, it's grain-based, and therefore you're going to make a mezainos. And the nach bracha, the bracha achrayna, is going to be a bracha achas bein shalish. It's going to be alamichya. What happens if you make French toast? If you make French toast, normally when you make French toast, each piece is bigger than a kezayis. Okay, so right away you have no shaila. If the piece is bigger than a kezayis, I don't care what you did with it. Because even if you cook it, it remains hamoitzi. You fried it, it certainly remains hamoitzi. How about if you made French toast out of little pieces of bread? Now we get into a hard area. Why? Because if you went ahead and you took pieces that are less than a kezayis and you soaked them in egg, and now you went ahead and you fried them, we're not sure if frying constitutes bishul. If it constitutes bishul, so then okay, you cooked it, it's less than a kezayis, there's no tayar lechem, it's a mezainos. But if frying is not akin to cooking, so then it could be that if it still has tayar lechem, and French toast usually has tayar lechem, Matzoh Brei usually has tayar lechem, then the Mishnah Berurah says you should wash on something, make hamoitzi, and you should eat this French toast or this Matzoh Brei b'soich hasuda. You should pater it with the hamoitzi that you made on a normal piece of bread and on benching. Now let's move on to scenario number 2. Scenario number 2, 3 lines down in the mechaber near the end of the line. How about if you broke up your bread, you broke up your matzah, you added a liquid agent, but you didn't cook it. You didn't cook it. Instead of cooking it, you combined the pieces together into one dish using something like honey. Says the Mechaber, V'meina mavushal. Let's say you didn't cook the bread. But you combined the pieces using a liquid binding agent, but you didn't cook it. Now, says the Mechaber, it depends. Im yesh paprusais kezayis. If the pieces have a kezayis, mevarach alav hamoitzi, you make a hamoitzi afilu ein lo yitayar lechem. Even if you think that the end product no longer has tayar lechem, since the pieces were bigger than a kezayis, you go ahead and you make a hamoitzi on it. The same thing that we saw in the previous scenario. In the previous scenario, the cooked product, zicha, doesn't have tayar lechem. Our assumption is that once you cook something, it takes off tayar lechem. But if the pieces are bigger than a kezayis, you make a hamoitzi. So too over here. If you have pieces that are bigger than a hamoitzi, over here in this scenario, you didn't even cook it. You just combined the pieces together with a binding agent. If the pieces are kezayis, you zicha make a hamoitzi, even if there's no tayar lechem. Vim ein behem kezayis, but what if the pieces are not a kezayis? If the pieces are not a kezayis, then says the Mechaber, the determining factor is going to be tayar lechem, because over here you didn't cook it, and since you didn't cook it, it's possible that there's still tayar lechem. Says the Mechaber, im yesh behem tayar lechem. If the pieces that are less than a kezayis still have tayar lechem, if they still look like bread, dahainu shehu nicker v'yadua shehu lechem. What does tayar lechem mean? It means shehu nicker, it's recognizable. V'yadua, and we know, we could tell shehu lechem that it's bread. Mevarach alav hamoitzi u'berkas hamazon. Then you make hamoitzi u'berkas hamazon. Ve'im ein behem tayar lechem. But if the pieces that are less than a kezayis do not have tayar lechem, mevarach bar yamina mezainos, you make a mezainos u'bracha achas me'ein shalosh. That's the end of scenario number 2. So scenario number 2 is you broke up your bread, you broke up your matzah into pieces. You didn't cook it. You just combined it. You combined the pieces into one dish using some kind of a binding agent, some kind of a liquid. What's the halacha? So the first thing the Mechaber says is, look, if the pieces are bigger than a kezayis, then of course it's hamoitzi because hamazon. Even in scenario number 1 where you cooked it, it remains hamoitzi and berkas hamazon. In scenario number 2 where you didn't even cook it, of course it's hamoitzi and berkas hamazon. That's if the pieces are kezayis or bigger. But what if the pieces are less than a kezayis? If the pieces are less than a kezayis, then we have to look at tayar lechem. In scenario number 1, where you cooked the pieces, if they're less than a kezayis, it's right away. Mezainis and bracha achas me'ein shalosh. Why? Because since you cooked it, we know right away there's no tayar lechem. But over here in scenario number 2, you didn't cook it. So now if the pieces are less than a kezayis, we have to look. Is there tayar lechem? If there's tayar lechem, it's hamoitzi. If there's no tayar lechem, then it's mezainos and bracha achas me'ein shalosh. Says the Mishnah Berurah, ois katan nun ches. If you did not cook this dish, if you took the pieces of bread and you just combined them with a liquid, so im yesh paprusais, if there's a kezayis, says the Mishnah Berurah, remember what this means. Hainu afilu ba'achas me'en. You look at the dish, even if there's one piece in the dish that's a kezayis, so you wash the tils yadayim, you make hamoitzi on that piece, and you pater everything else. Ois cotton nun tes. But the Mechaber says, what if the pieces are less than a kezayis? If the pieces are less than a kezayis, then the determining factor becomes tayar lechem. And the Mechaber said, im yesh behem tayar lechem, ois cotton nun tes. If the pieces that are less than a kezayis have tayar lechem, then you have to make mezainos and bracha achas. Then it's hamoitzi. If they have tayar lechem, then even though it's less than a kezayis, you make hamoitzi. Hatam the odif bazeh oifen harishain. Chavetz Chaim in Ois Katan Nun Tes says, understand. Let's contrast the halach of the first scenario to the halach of the second scenario. In the halach of the first scenario where you cooked the pieces, then we said if the pieces are less than a kezayis, even if you think it has tayar lechem, the bracha is mezainos. Why? Because you cooked it. In the second scenario, if the pieces are less than a kazayas, Torah lechem helps. So in the first scenario, even if you think the pieces of Torah lechem, since it's less than a kazayas, you make them a zaynis. So Torah lechem doesn't help. Torah lechem does not elevate the bracha to hamaitzi. In the second scenario, where you didn't cook it, if the pieces are less than a kazayas, if it retains Torah lechem, the bracha is elevated to hamaitzi. So now the Chavetz Chaim addresses that difference between scenario number 1 and scenario number 2. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Hatam da adif bazeh me'ofen harishain. The reason why in the second scenario Torah lechem helps, and Torah lechem says that even though the pieces are less than a kazayas, the bracha is hamaitzi, is the kevin shaloin is partial, because since in this scenario you didn't cook the pieces, you just combined them. Torah lechem shaloin chashiva. The Torah lechem is a real Torah lechem. It's choshev shehu nikar v'yadua yoser, because yes, it could be nikar v'yadua that it's lechem because you didn't cook it. But in scenario number 1, you cooked it. If you cook it, our assumption is there's no Torah lechem, even if you think there is Torah lechem. Umashe kosav u'berkas hamazon. And this that the Mechaber says that the noch bracha, the bracha achroina, is berkas hamazon, realize hainu kisha'achal kama pirur not shir kazayas. That's only true if you ate enough of this dish that you ate a kazayas. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, imperior alechem ad sheherziran l'soilus. Let's say you ground up pas until you mamish returned it to flour. So you took matzah, we do this in the matzah bakery. You took matzah, and you grind it into what they call cake meal. You ground it so fine that it's like flour, but it's not flour. It was baked matzah that you ground up. So let's say you took pas, you took bread or matzah, and you ground it so fine it's like you returned it to flour. Now you went ahead and you took that matzah meal or cake meal, and you kneaded it with some kind of oil or fat. What the Chavetz Chaim says we call either Kneidlach or crumbled. You could take a look at the Magen Avram. Spoiler: the Magen Avram says the bracha would be hamaitzi, but the agreement of most of the Akrainim is the im bishlan bikdera. If you went there and you cooked it in a pot, or you fried it in a frying pan together with a mashke, even if the knedel or the kremzel or the pancake that you made out of this is a kazayas or bigger, why? Because the breadcrumbs were less than a kazayas. These were breadcrumbs that were less than a kazayas that you cooked. Breadcrumbs that are less than a kazayas that you cooked, the bracha is mezainos. And that's the minig of the Welt. But what if you baked it? So what if on Pesach you took cake meal, you mixed it with oil, eggs, you made a bagel shape out of it, and then you go ahead and you bake it in the oven. Then you should wash on something else and you eat it b'saych hasuda. You should not pater it with the mezainos. Unless you kneaded it together with a lot of oil or honey, because now at best it's possible b'kistin ukidel b'siv zayin b'haga. But if you kneaded it with straight water, va'afon, and you baked it, Yeshalem din pas gomor, then it's mamish pas gomor. Okay, we're going to stop over here. We'll continue next time with the Mechaber's addressing scenario number 3 of Chavitza. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be made like God's Klal Yisrael. The Rosh Hashanah should send Yeshua's for us, Panos, and Shidduchim to those in need. And we should be zeicher to the Geula Shlema with the B.S. Gael Tzedek B'Mehera V'Yameinu Amen. Be well.